Fundamentally, I'm of the opinion that music has no place in movies because 99% of its function is to compensate for a deficit in their suspense or excitement. Emotions which are not created through the plot or action, the cinematography, or by the actors is then produced with a musical sauce underneath everything. That's why there's no music in my films, except when it appears in the story. Those are words from director Michael Haneke on his 2001 film, The Piano Teacher. Seeing Faces in Movies is a podcast where each month I focus on the works of a different director or cinematographer, and each week I invite a guest on to discuss the film and the artist's filmography. I'm your host, Felicia, and today we're talking about The Piano Teacher. So, quick synopsis of the film is Erica's piano professor at a Viennese conservatory who lives with her mother in a claustrophobically codependent relationship. Severely repressed, she satisfies her masochistic urges only voyeuristically until she meets Walter, a student whose desire for Erica leads to destructive infatuation that upsets the careful equilibrium of her life. Tagline for the film is perversion at its wicked best. The film stars Isabelle Huppert as Erica Kohut, Annie Girardot as the mother, Benoît Magimel as Walter Clemmer, and Suzanne Lother as Mrs. Schober. It's written by Michael Haneke, based on the novel by Elfriede Jelinek, cinematography by Christian Berger, directed by Michael Haneke, edited by Nadine Muse and Monica Willi, and costumes by Annette Beaufet. This marks the last episode in the Haneke series. If you followed along, thank you so much. If you listened to one episode, thank you so much. And if this is the first episode you're listening to in the series, again, thank you so much. Highly recommend you check out Haneke's other films if you haven't already, or revisit them if it's been a while. I know they can be a little tough, but they're worth it. And then you can listen to my guest and I chat about them in our other episodes. So on to The Piano Teacher. Today, my guest is Jeanmarie Vargas. I'm beyond stoked to have you on. I love your taste in film and just your whole person in general. So thank you so much for coming on. This is like the perfect episode, I think, to have you on.
Thank you, Felicia. That was a very kind introduction, and I'm just as excited to be on and talking to you about this. We haven't talked too much one-on-one, so very excited.
I know. I was hoping to have you on, and to be honest, no spoilers for later, but I feel like I have another series coming up in the next couple of months where I'm like, for Haruka, we're talking Piano Teacher today, but I'm curious to hear what your relationship is to his other work. Are you familiar with, are you a fan of his other work, and when you started discovering his films?
Yeah, my relationship to him and his films, I wish I've seen more, but I can say I've seen Funny Games, as we all have, the 1997 one, and Caché, which I saw both of those probably back in like 2009 or 10, and I don't remember Caché very well, so I can't really speak to that or what my thoughts about it were. But Funny Games definitely made an impression on me, and I think it was a good film, but I can't say that I enjoyed it exactly.
Yeah. I feel like that's how I feel about most of his stuff, where I'm like,
Yeah,
this is fantastic, but I wasn't having a good time.
unenjoyable, but good.
But good. Something that you're like, yeah, this is like good work, but it's not one that I'm having a fun time with. And he doesn't want you to have a fun time either. So,
No, he doesn't. That is the opposite of what he wants.
and you see that in the film we're talking about today, which is Piano Teacher. So this is the first one he did that was actually based off a novel. The other stuff, he's done other ones that were based off of like a news story, like 71 Fragments is based off a news story. So was The Seventh Continent, but he still wrote the scripts himself. He did write the screenplay for this, but it is based off a book, which I haven't read, admittedly.
No.
Rewatching this, I would be interested to read it because it is supposed to be autobiographical.
Yes.
So I'm
Yeah.
wondering, how many like liberties he took with this, especially with the ending. And I'm wondering just like, what were your thoughts watching this, even especially rewatching?
I'm going to say, why did I watch this the first time? I guess it has a reputation, and I was vaguely aware that it dealt with sadomasochism and would be an intense and thought-provoking film. So that said, I first watched this maybe last year, the year before, and I did find it very intense and thought-provoking. And like I said about Funny Games, I didn't enjoy it, although it was an easier watch for me. And what's interesting, rewatching it again for the podcast, I found myself feeling a little apprehensive. Like, oh, I don't know if I want to go through this again. But trying to analyze it and look at it through different lenses made it an easier watch, instead of getting so involved in the story and everything that's happening.
Yeah, I 100% agree. I think the stuff that I've been covering for this series, I've for the most part seen before, and even something like did cover Funny Games, and that movie still makes me sick to my stomach. I love it, but like my heart was so, racing watching it, and I've seen it a bunch of times. This one I always found really hard to watch. I think I first saw it. It's definitely been over 10 years ago that I first saw it, when I was starting to go through his stuff. And I remember just being shocked because I'd never seen anything like it. But I hadn't revisited it in a long time. So rewatching it this time, I think because I knew I had to look for certain things, or I was, analyzing a bit more than as opposed to like surface level, I was able to appreciate a lot more of it. I loved it the first time, but it's one that you're like, okay, I don't know that I need to relive that on a constant, regular basis.
Yeah.
So it's interesting for sure.
Yeah, which speaks to, I think that is his intention. Just after reading several interviews with Haneke, I think I don't want to say he doesn't dislike the audience, but he doesn't like people to be titillated by the violence.
Oh yeah, that's something I definitely want to hold on to. And we'll speak about that because I think that's really important to chat about. But I find that this one, if people listening are familiar with a few of it as other films, I find it's a little less cold, and it still is quite cold, but it's a little less. And I wonder if it's because of the music that gets played. He often has music being played that's actually being paid by people, or it's like in Funny Games, a CD that we hear music being played off of. But this has like a lot of great lengthy piano scenes, and there is a calming air about watching people play piano. So it feels a little bit more lived in than his other stuff. So I'm wondering how you feel about that, just the way it's framed around music and knowing what these characters are going through.
Yeah, that's interesting because I think in a lot of the other films, maybe there's not so much music or a soundtrack really, but this one you have to have the music because it's about piano teacher and piano and musicians. But yeah, what you said about making it feel more lived in, yeah, it's definitely correct. It brings a little bit of warmth to the cold scenes, but it's an interesting juxtaposition, I guess, to have these beautiful, expressive pieces contrasted with the personal anguish and repression that the main character is going through. And yeah, the word expression, that's particularly interesting. I hear her criticizing her students a lot about expression while they're playing the music, but especially at the beginning, don't see a lot of emotional expression from her. But she does seem to have a deep relationship with the music and the composers. She mentions Schubert and Schumann a lot and their personal struggles with madness, I think one of them, and mental issues. So that's interesting.
Yeah, it is interesting is probably the best word to describe it. I remember, rewatching it for this, realizing she doesn't receive any sort of physical touch at all for most of the movie, apart from the man that she sort of has a relationship with, I guess. But she doesn't have any physical touch from her mother, who she lives with.
Yeah.
The idea of sexual repression, which is a huge theme in this movie. And the fact that it is written by a woman and starring a woman about women, but it is directed by a man. And I was reading a few articles, and one person who said that they felt that he stepped away a little bit more and really had nothing to say and was kind of just presenting it as is, which is interesting because I do think he does have something to say, but I'm not sure what it is. I don't think he's taking necessarily a stance on it, but there is still his hand and his personality through the way he created this story. But the idea of shooting a film about a woman who is sexually oppressed, but also has these fantasies that she lives out in a very specific way, in ways that some of those scenes have stuck with me forever, in the way she treats herself and the interests that she has and how she likes to explore it. I'm wondering how you feel about a man tackling this type of story and the way he did it. If you felt there was judgment, or if you felt he stood back and kind of just let things play it out.
Yeah, I guess it's complicated. Although he must have seen something in the book that interested him and that he resonated with. I read in an interview that I think he chose this one to write a screenplay of because it just seemed, I guess it was told in a very linear fashion. But in the same interview, the interviewer asks him about about women and children in his film being portrayed like as strong characters, and he said they play an important role because victims interest me more than perpetrators. Women, and this is also true of other directors, are the more interesting characters because they're farther down in the pecking order. The alternative to plumbing the depths of their psyches is the hero who has no psychology and is only a victor. All in all, I'm more interested in women. Men bore me, which is interesting, but I was a little offended because, um, our experiences and pain isn't trivial, and it's more than just interesting. So it's complicated. I don't know that I wouldn't say the film is necessarily feminist or misogynist, but I think I do believe him when he says he is more interested in the psychology of women. Although, now that I mention it, it almost feels, at least from reading that statement, that he is, I don't know if it almost sounds like he's kind of titillated by the psychological um, drama of women. But at the same time, I know he said that he is critical of people who enjoy violent film just for the sake of violence. So that seems a bit hypocritical. But, I don't know. Maybe it was like it lost the translation. Maybe I don't understand his
Yeah.
intent.
I think so too. I think it's a mix of both, to be honest. That's something I definitely wanted to talk about in the trademarks bit, but just like his kind of dependency on strong women characters, because his most popular ones, even something like a Funny Games, yeah, there are other people, but essentially it is the woman who lasts the longest in that film. And he picks really strong actors to portray those roles. I can 100% see that he's bored by men, and I feel like he often writes characters who are male characters who are pretty vile. I think that he's uninterested by people who have power, in quotes. I think the way he described it there is very blunt. And part of me thinks, yeah, he might also be a little titillated by, the trauma that women have to endure. But there's some part of him that's also sympathetic, I think. But he's incredibly blunt about it.
Yeah, I would agree.
So it's interesting to hear that quote, because I don't doubt that he said those exact words. It sounds exactly like him. Actually, before we go to the second segment, I'm just wondering how you feel because we both know this is a book, but we both haven't read it about the ending. So I always assume that people listening to this, they've seen the movie, so we don't have to go through every scene, but a lot happens. And in the end, she's just kind of, I don't know, who knows what's going on in her mind. To be honest, we're not really given too much insight into what's going on in her mind. Most of the time, we're relying on Isabel's performance to take us through this character's actions, and she stabbed herself in the end. And then she leaves the theater and walks off, and then it cuts to black. So we don't know what happens to her. She stabs herself in a place that I assume she should probably be able to survive from. Who knows? I also have no idea if
Mm-hmm.
she stabbed herself in the book. Wanted to check, but I was like, if I want to read the book, I want to see if maybe he did change it or not. So wondering how you feel about that ending and the abruptness of it.
Well, it's certainly not out of character for her after we've seen this film. I guess I interpreted it the way I've interpreted her other self-harming, masochistic actions throughout the movie. And I think maybe part of it is that she is trying to be the object rather than the subject. And even if she's hurting herself, at least she has some control and agency. I think that's probably how I interpret it because she's repressed and there's obviously a lot of oppression coming from her own mother. And it just seems that she doesn't have many avenues of self-expression
Yeah.
other than the music, I suppose. But yeah, I guess I interpret that as her being the object rather than the subject, especially after what she went through in the scene prior.
Yeah. Jeez. I definitely felt it on this watch of I think it's exactly what you said. And her at the end of it all wanting to have the power. I read another article that I link everything in the show notes because there's actually quite a few great articles, especially through Criterion on this movie.
Mm-hmm.
And one where yes, it's called The Piano Teacher, and she is literally a piano teacher, but she's also a teacher in other ways where she's teaching him her ways. And she might
Mm-hmm.
be a masochist in quotes, but she's still the one in control because she's calling the shots from the most part. So I think this is her way of being like, you think that you had the upper hand in our last interaction, but no one can hurt me like myself, I think. It's the way she probably goes about her life, unfortunately. So it's interesting. It's heavy.
Yeah, yeah. And I think about it, I don't know if it's a way of differentiating herself from her mother by becoming the dominant
Hmm.
person in all these interactions, but at the same time, she's occupying that same role with her students and trying to with Walter, at least in the beginning of their relationship.
Hmm. Yeah. It's interesting the way she navigates her students too, because for a long time, you only see little bits and pieces of her doing piano lessons, and then you get to see her at her, how important she actually is in her place of work or school that she works
Mm-hmm.
in. And the way that she's like very cold. But then she does have some sort of, I think she's not fully cut off. She does have feelings for people when they're not a threat to her. One of the scenes I'm thinking of is when one of the young girls' mother comes up to her and was like, you told her that she might not make it to the play in the show. She's been practicing. And then she goes and says, hey, I never said that, but you do need to work harder. But like, that's just, we can work on this. So she is not fully like, I don't care until she felt like this girl was a threat. And we can talk about that later and what the actions that she does towards that girl,
Mm-hmm.
the violence there. But she's definitely an interesting character. And like Isabel, I think the writer herself also really wanted her to play that character, and she's just a powerhouse, like insane
Yeah.
performance. It's so good.
Her performance is amazing.
Yeah. I can't imagine anyone else doing something like that. But the second segment we can move to, which is the before and after. So this film is 2001. The film he did right before this in 2000 was Code Unknown, and that's starring Juliette Binoche. That was his first French film. So prior to that, he'd been making German language films.
Hmm.
So the last German language film he did, the 1997 Funny Games, and then he moved to Code Unknown. And then from then, he kind of just started only making French films until he did The White Ribbon in 2009. And then after that, he made like two more French films. So he's obviously feels comfortable with that language. And that's where you start to see that he's really shifting towards having women in the forefront and having these like actresses who are known for being able to, portray any character and unabashedly so. And Juliette is up there with Isabelle. And then right after Piano Teacher, he does Time of the Wolf in 2003, which is a film that
Hmm.
I only recently just watched. No one really talks about this movie. I don't even know that I knew it existed for the longest time. It's interesting because there are parts of it that do seem like him, but it's very different. It's a kind of a post-apocalyptic movie, and it
Hmm.
stars Isabelle Huppert, and it's essentially a sci-fi movie in the sense that it takes place in the future, and it's these people trying to struggle to live. And it's not a bad film in any sense. It's just one that you probably, I don't know that I'd rewatch. So people kind of dismissed it over his other stuff that are darker. This was dark in the way that any post-apocalyptic movie is going to be dark. So knowing that, and you don't have to have seen those movies yourself or the audience, but knowing
Yeah.
the shift of now he's Time of the Wolf is also French, and we have in each three of these movies female characters who are in the forefront who are either taking care of families, taking care of themselves, or are pretty standout characters with their own personalities and faults. How do you feel the piano teacher fits within his filmography?
Yeah. I guess it sounds like maybe it marked a change in direction to featuring more of the female characters instead of focusing. It sounds like I haven't seen what's the one Benny's.
Benny's
You
video.
probably, yeah,
Yeah.
Benny's video. Yeah, films that are less about
Yeah.
violent men,
Hmm.
um, more about women and featuring these, like you said, these amazing actresses. It sounds like the one after the piano teacher, maybe that was just an experiment and trying something different.
I think
I guess
so.
he didn't continue in that. But yeah, like maybe, yeah, maybe this film marked a change in direction for him. Also, I would love to see a white ribbon that's on. Maybe I'll watch that later tonight. Wish I could have watched it before this, but
It's great, especially because it goes back to German language. And for some reason, I put it off for so long because I thought for some reason it was like a World War II, Holocaust type of movie because of the way people were talking about it, but it's not. It actually takes place before even World War One.
yeah.
But it's sort of, I guess people have taken it to be like an allegory for how people turned out to how they ended up being Nazis
Yeah.
without giving too much away, but it's one where like my jaw was on the ground. Like it's so beautifully done, but also again, not a fun time in any sense
Oh
of the word.
boy.
So it's
Yeah.
not, yeah, it's weird because I feel like there's funny games dark and then there's something like a piano teacher dark. I feel like it's more along piano teacher than it is funny games, if that makes
Okay. That's
sense.
I don't know if I can take that, that kind of darkness again in
Yeah.
funny games.
No, Funny Games is its own thing. I can't think of any other. Maybe his earliest stuff, like Benny's videos, more so, but
Yeah.
funny games than White Ribbon. White Ribbon is just like it's beautifully made, but it's less traumatizing, I would say, even if there's some dark stuff happening for sure, as always with him. But yeah, it's interesting because then after, like you said, Time of the Wolf seems to have been like a kind of a one-off, because then he goes to do Caché right after that. And then he does the Funny Games remake, White Ribbon, and so on. So it's interesting where Piano Teacher lies and how it's probably one of his most popular for sure. I'd say Funny Games is obviously maybe the most popular, but Piano Teacher is one that's, especially for her performance, that gets spoken about so much.
Yeah.
Because there's a lot of imagery in that other films and filmmakers wouldn't want to tackle, and other actors who wouldn't want to tackle that. So it's quite brave, I would say.
Yeah, definitely brave.
For the third segment, trademarks, we've kind of spoken a little bit about stuff that he tackles in his other works. And I just kind of wanted to go back on the actresses that he employs and has worked with, because he's worked with Binoche quite a few times and he's worked with Dupin quite a few times. There's also Suzanne Lothair, who was in this movie. She plays the mom of the girl.
Yes.
And she's also in Funny Games. She's also in White Ribbon.
She's remarkable
Yeah.
as well.
She'll show up in every now and again, and she's always fantastic. And I think he has a dependency, and I don't mean that in like a negative way, but he does depend on these women to kind of carry the story, because a lot of times, because of how dark these subject matters are, if the performance isn't one that you can believe, I think people would dismiss them. I'm wondering how you feel about kind of depending on those actresses to sell this story to an audience who probably is not wanting to watch something like this.
It's great for their careers.
Yeah.
They seem to be having the opposite experience of what, maybe it's changing now, but the opposite experience of what a lot of American actresses have. It seems like they're getting these really fleshed out, unique roles as they age.
Yeah.
I think their best work is their more recent work in these films. So yeah, like I don't want to say I don't feel that he is burdening them with the labor of selling these films, but or maybe he is, but they're doing amazing work, and yeah, it's just very unique compared to a lot of the American actresses, I think.
I know. It's unfortunate that both of those actors, I know Isabelle Huppert is like in her 70s now and she's still getting great roles because she's not really working within the North American film system. And she has, well, she's a name, obviously, but she has all these directors who would like jump to write her a role. And it's not something you often see for women actors in North America. I feel like you turn a certain age and then all of a sudden you're just either forgotten, or it's like a boring mom role. Whereas like when they're playing mom roles, they're not boring in any sense.
It's intense.
Yeah, there's layers to that. They're not just a mom. Like most moms are not just a mom. There's all other things going on. But I think in North American films often forget that for some reason. So it's interesting to think of a director that people think hates people, but I think he's so fascinated by people. And it seems like he's more fascinated by women and their struggles, and portraying that in a way that's realistic, as opposed to being like, oh, it's fine that they go through these, they can overcome it. It's like sometimes they can't because of the way the world works. So it's interesting to think of him that way. I don't know if he's a feminist. I don't know if that he would ever use that word, to be honest. And that's fine if he doesn't. I have never heard him be asked if he considers himself one.
Yeah.
I think I'll know a lot of feminists who would think of his work as that way. So it's interesting, I think. But something I noticed, especially rewatching a lot of his films, and in this one, he likes to examine power shifts, especially when it comes to, binary gendered power shifts, men versus women. And we see it a lot in this movie where two people are essentially kind of fighting for the top spot. And I don't think the point is who won. It's more so how they go about it and why certain one might be, coming over top. One is because she's older, she's a teacher, he's a student, and then sometimes when the power shifts is because, he'll say something like, you can't treat a man that way. You can't do that to a man. These rules that he is just claiming are a fact. How do you view the power shifts in this movie?
Yeah, it does seem that whenever they're in a more sexual realm or in that relationship realm, that she can't get the upper hand, that he definitely has the power there. It's so interesting when she first reads that letter, or she has him read the letter she wrote him, and he's just disgusted. But now I wonder if he's more disgusted by the content of the letter, or that she would be so forthright in naming her desires and asking for them. That said, it was a very bizarre theme. You wouldn't, I would never.
Yeah, I mean, no.
But I think that's how I interpreted it. And then later, he thinks, or he says, I am doing what you asked me to do, when he essentially rapes her later in the apartment. But now it's on his terms, instead of hers, I think.
It's interesting, the power shifts there, especially when it comes to the more sex-driven scenes, and which leads me to another part I want to talk about in terms of like violence being depicted on screen, because he often, like you said earlier, he's kind of against people being titillated by violence, and he often has violence in his films, but it takes place off screen. So I know I always come back to like Funny Games because I think that's probably the most obvious example. There's a lot of violence in that, but it's taken place off screen, and half the time you're hearing it while something else you're seeing, or you're seeing the aftermath of it. This is one of the first where you're actually seeing violence being taken place, whether it's like self-mutilation or he's beating on her or she stabs herself. But in terms of the sexual component of this and the violence that she claims that she likes in the letter that she has him read, it's interesting because there is a scene prior to that where we see her go to a sex shop, I guess, and there's a cubicle and she's watching pornography. And because of her home life, she lives with her mom. They share a room. She doesn't seem to have a social life. You wonder, has she ever slept with someone? I don't know. And maybe the only type of sex that she knows is the stuff that she's watching in these videos that is usually a little bit more aggressive. So maybe that's why she's interested in that, which is like another layer of stuff to add on to her character. So like when you said, is he more disgusted by the contents or the fact that she's so open about it, is super interesting because it could be both. I think maybe on this watch, I read it as he was maybe more disgusted that she would admit it because he's not used to women, having desires that of their own, probably.
Yeah.
So in terms of like that and the violence that we see in this, and it being so upfront and kind of in your face, how do you feel that he navigates it in this versus his other movies?
It is a more explicit. After I finished this, though, I thought about it. I'm like, yeah, this is a little more explicit, but still, it's not quite as graphic as other horror movies and violent films that I'm used to seeing. Yeah, well, I mean, she stabs herself, and I know there's a lot of blood throughout the film, but there is some of the violence does occur out of view of the camera. I know, like when he kicks her in one of the last scenes, and that's out of view of the camera. But still, yeah, it is more violent than his other films visually. And yeah, that's a little uncomfortable that he made that decision as he shifted to films with the female lead. So the violence is being done to her So that's, yeah, I don't know what I make of it, but that's an interesting thing to point out. And she is the perpetrator of a lot of the violence as well, the cutting and with the stabbing herself at the end. So yeah, that maybe that goes back to what I was saying earlier of her having more of the power over her own fate.
Yeah, I mean, pretty much. It is interesting, and like the more we talk about it, the more I want to read the book because especially because the author says it is autobiographical, so
Yeah,
that's a wild story to tell, and I could see
I heard that.
why he would be interested in, creating a film version of it. But I wonder how much of it is sort of like these are, elements of myself as opposed to these are things that actually happen. So I'd be interested to see,
I,
how much of this, because I remember one scene that stuck with me like from the first time I watched it was the kind of the bathtub scene and being like,
mhm.
wait, what is going on here? And just how like it was premeditated. She takes the razor out of like a Kleenex that she's wrapped up. So she obviously has done this before and something she just does as a release.
Very ritualized.
Yeah. And that makes it darker than her just being like on impulse doing it because she's upset about something. It's something that she does, like you said, as a ritual. So very complex character. And like if we continue on the violence bit, one of the first scenes is kind of like an altercation between her and her mother.
Hmm.
Because the mother accuses her of lying as to where she is. It's funny because there's not much happening before that. The first thing you see is Isabelle Huppert, and just because we can see her as an actress, we know that she's not a young woman. She's a woman of an age that she shouldn't necessarily have to answer to her mother where she's been. But the mother's like, you were done your lessons 3 hours ago. Where have you been? She says she went for a walk. She grabs her bag and goes through it, and they get into a physical altercation. But then, like, the release of that is like they both cry about it and they're apologizing and they're like, oh, we're hot headed. But it is quite violent to grab anyone that way, but probably more so your own mother. And to open the movie like
Yeah,
that, like, I think sets the scene. I'm wondering how you feel about that open.
yeah. That was very jarring. It definitely sets the scene for the whole film, and it's just shocking. Erica's an older woman than them. You know, you can't imagine treating your mother that way,
Hmm.
physically or in the things that they say to each other. I can't imagine, but that is maybe in a way it is more shocking than some of the physical violence we see beginning of the film, and just sets us up for what we're about to witness.
I think so. And I like what you said that it's probably more shocking than the like more overt stuff. I think that's what he's known for. Sometimes he'll show something that's like an everyday thing that we know is plausible that's more shocking than something as overt, like someone, cutting themselves that way in a bathtub is not something that you're going to see or hear about every day, but getting into an argument with your parent is, whether it's physical or not. I would say most people probably don't get into a physical argument with their parents, but you can kind of feel the frustration on her part, even that early in the movie. And I mean, that's just great acting from the both of them. But it's interesting to see the dynamic and the codependency that they have on each other because it might seem like the mother's more dependent on her, but she's equally as dependent on her mother. And that's why they've stayed together and they kind of argue about saving up to buy their own house. And there is a brief mention of the father
Mhm.
dying, but then they never talk about it again. So it's like they've been together at all times forever, and like every single day they're together. So I know that he kind of tackles almost all his movies like a sort of family dynamic. I can't think of a single movie where there's not really a family portion of it, and he tackling the rules of each person. How do you feel about the way he does it here with the two women and the way they interact?
Yeah, it's so fascinating. You would think an adult like that, you would think, doesn't she just leave, move out, and get her own apartment? But despite a lot of the anger she has towards her mom, doing some research, I guess, along with viewing the film
Hmm.
and reading about, I guess, psychoanalysis of films,
Hmm.
I'm almost convinced that there's some Freudian ideas,
Yeah.
Freudian situations going on here with her and her mother. and her sexuality. For example, I was reading about psychosexual stage. So according to Freud, like, I mean, or I don't, it's ridiculous. But maybe not. I don't know. Anyway, according to Freud, there's like a psychosexual stage in young children where they will get sexual gratification related, with their genitals, and that's an immaturity that we grow out of. And her sexual gratification seems to come from all these things that have like nothing to do. You know, she's urinating outside of the car.
Yeah.
And even urinating after the scene where her student cuts her hand on the glass in her pocket. But yeah, you asked about family. But that's all related, I guess, like looking at it through a Freudian lens. It's almost like she didn't mature past a point where she differentiated herself from her mother, or she's trying to go back to that stage. So the codependency between them and her sexuality definitely seem to be intertwined. And that's really interesting. And yeah, I don't really know I haven't studied Freud or read a lot about it, but from what I read online, that makes sense to me.
Yeah. I mean, I feel like 100% makes sense. And I could see Haneke being along the same lines of that. And like you said, I feel like she didn't mature past the stage because I think their only way to mature fully is to have a distance between yourself and your parents. Even if you were to say to go back, you do need to differentiate yourself from your parent. And I don't know that she has fully. That's why they have such a weird relationship with the two and the way, like, the peeing stuff that you mentioned, which I don't know, for some reason I had completely forgotten about that from my last watch to this one. And I was like, oh yeah, she does that twice in this movie. I think I just kind of omitted it from my head, but I feel like it's even more interesting when she does it right after she sees the girl where she breaks up glass and puts it in her pocket because she views her a bit of as a threat because she thinks that she's flirting with the man that she loves or is interested in. So she injures her so she can no longer play. And then right after she goes up and, and urinates, which is really interesting. And it's a detail that, like most of his films, and one of the last points I want to talk about specifically was with most of his films, he has these characters, he has these stories, and these characters are doing things that most of us think of as maybe a little bit weird or dark, but he never gives an explanation as to why they're doing it. He's like, I'm going to show you this. You have your own thoughts. And he does the same way here. You might think, oh, she's this way because of her relationships with her mom, but that doesn't fully explain why she's fully like this. You can have issues with your mom and not be like this. He's just like, I'm going to show you this and you have your own thoughts because I think he respects the audience enough to have their own thoughts. So wondering how you feel about how we're watching these stories and we're not given a reason ever as to why they are the way they are.
I like that because it means I have to think about it and figure out the interpretation. So that's probably where I get my enjoyment of these films.
Yeah.
Even though they're not enjoyable. I think in the book, there's more backstory and more detail about her early life.
Okay.
But then I think he deliberately omits a lot of that because he doesn't want to tell us what to think. And I don't even know if he knows what he thinks about it. It's just open to our own interpretations. Although, yeah, that detail, now that I read about Freud, that does seem like a pretty obvious detail.
Yeah.
Urinating with after sexual situations.
Yeah. And it is interesting that the book probably does, like you said, have more background because she's telling her story. So she probably wants to give a bit more background. And then him being like, that's not really important to the story that he wants to tell because you'll see it in all of his films, even if you go back, because you're thrown into it. You're not given any sort of backstory as opposed to like, we're just watching like essentially a couple weeks of her life and then that's it.
Right. Yeah. And he's said in interviews that he's trying to get the viewer to be intellectually independent and see, as he says, see their own role in game of manipulation. So he really does believe in our intelligence and gives us the option of interpreting his work.
Yeah, which is, I think, why his films will kind of stand the test of time. Sometimes I think when I don't have a problem necessarily if a director has a firm opinion on something that's it's their, story to tell. But sometimes you watch something and you're like, well, this is incredibly outdated because your
Yeah.
views match a certain time. Whereas his, we're watching even this one, this is 2001 and it's 2024. It's actually kind of an older film now and it still feels fresh,
It's
like something
wild.
that could happen today, tomorrow, because there's no opinion placed on it. We're just shown these facts about these characters. So I think that's why his films will always kind of be relevant to people and why we're still talking about the stuff he did in the 90s because of that. So, yeah, I don't think we have to really convince anyone to watch it. If for some reason you're listening to this and you haven't watched it, it's one that is being advocated by many people. So if we're not convincing you, many other people can convince you. I think it's definitely one of his best, and it probably would be a good place to start if you haven't seen any of his stuff, to be honest, to just kind of throw yourself right into it. And just note that, yeah, great story, but it's not going to be a good time. So maybe be in the right headspace for it if you're going through some dark stuff.
Definitely interesting, but not really an enjoyable time.
No, it's never. I think if he were to ever, I mean, who knows how many more films he has in him, but if he were to ever release a film that's like a good time, it would just be weird. I would question it. I'd be like, I feel like he's tricking me.
It would feel sinister, honestly.
Probably. I would just like, I don't believe this. So what's going on that I'm not seeing? But the last question I have for you, the double bill portion. So if you were to recommend another film to pair with this film or films, if you have more than one, what film would you recommend a person watch alongside this one?
So I thought about this for a while and I wasn't sure. But then this week, Seth and I covered a film for his Movie Friends podcast, his Patreon group. And we covered the film Beau is Afraid. And after rewatching that this week, I think that would be a good pairing. Similar themes, but perhaps more explicit, but a similar theme.
Yeah, I haven't seen that one yet, but I know that there's a lot of mommy issue stuff.
Yeah, and this will be other side of the coin, how it relates to a man and his masculinity.
Exactly. So I think it's good to have a balance of both and see the way two different directors would tackle it. I could see that Ari Aster would be a fan of Haneke's for sure. And the way he tackles stuff.
Yeah, he recommends Piano Teacher, so maybe he was influenced by it.
There you go. I could 100% see that he'd be a huge fan. That's so much fun. The one I thought of, I also thought about it for a while where I was like, I want to know. I still kind of kept with women on my side, but I thought of a movie called Secret Ceremony. That's directed by Joseph Losey in 1968. It's Mia Farrow, Liz Taylor, and Robert Mitchum. Sorry. And Mia Farrow's kind of like a Isabelle Huppert style character where she's essentially kind of an orphan now. She's an adult, but she has a very kind of childlike demeanor where she obviously was just with her mother and she lived with her mother and the mother passed away. And then she meets Liz Taylor, who looks exactly like her mother and decides to adopt her as her mother. And they have a very weird dynamic. It's really weird movie. So if you're wanting to watch something that's also weird, it's a different type of weird. I think all three of the movies that we're talking about here are all weird in their own way and dark in their own type of way. So it's one that you could just carve out some time where you're like, yeah, I think I'm in an okay place.
That's an amazing cast. And it looks like I just Googled it while you were talking about it. And it also looks like a very colorful, really interesting movie.
Yeah.
But I'll definitely check it out.
Yeah, it is interesting. It's really weird. It's like the late 60s, early 70s where they were starting to be kind of weird with the stuff that they put out. And then things stopped after that. I don't know. things haven't been as weird, but they were just putting stuff out there, and like aging Hollywood actors were like, well, these younger directors want to work with me, and they're the other ones who are going to give me roles in films and their weird stuff. So Liz Taylor especially always did some weird stuff in her late career, and she's just top tier for me. So I'd recommend that one. It's weird for sure. I don't think it's anywhere near as dark as Piano Teacher, but it has elements of darkness for sure. So any three of those movies, and if you have the time, why not watch all three? Triple bill, the three of them.
Yeah,
you could.
A long day.
Winter's coming, so we're going to be inside for a while. But this is amazing. Thank you so much for talking about The Piano Teacher with me. I thought it's great to have your insight as a human being and as a woman about this film. So I had a great time talking about a sad movie.
Me too. Thank you. I'll happy to talk about some sad movies in the future.
Seeing Faces in Movies is an official podcast of the Royal Film Club. It's hosted and edited by Felicia Maroney, with intro music by Lamar Walker. If you like what you heard, let us know at seeingfacesmovies.com or send us an email at seeingfacesmovies@gmail.com. And while you're at it, please subscribe and rate the show wherever you listen to podcasts. And thank you for joining us in the Michael Haneke series. Watch our movies, and we'll see you for the next series.